Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, during the past week, you might have seen headlines about a chaplain in a private school who made a sermon, as chaplains do, and ended up being referred to Prevent, which is the anti-terrorism organisation, which is meant to prevent radicalisation. I'm very pleased that the man at the centre of this extraordinary story is with us today. That's the Reverend Dr. Randall. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, absolutely. Thank you.
I want us, to go through your whole story, of course, but if you can sort of start off with what I just said there. You did a sermon, and somehow or other, I think without your knowledge,
that's right.
You were referred to Prevent.
Yes.
Now, how?
If only I knew. I mean, I struggle to understand exactly why, even now. The situation arose because the school I was working at, Trent College, halfway between Nottingham and Derby, introduced a programme from an organisation called Educate and Celebrate, which goes into schools to promote a very LGBT plus friendly programme, some of which is absolutely unexceptional. No one should be bullied for their sexual orientation or anything like that, right. Obviously. And the idea that you might in the curriculum make sure that there are elements of diversity across race and sexual orientation and so on, absolutely fine. And, was the curriculum a bit too pale and male and stale? Probably. Doesn't hurt to refresh it, absolutely. And I had no objection to that. But they also smuggle in the sort of identity politics agenda on the back of this thing that no one can object to comes something rather, more controversial, let's say. So they arrived at school in September of 2018 and did a staff training session. As I say, some of it was fine, but other bits of it really worried me, and in particular, the idea that gender identity is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act.
It's not, is it?
Which it's not. So they had the 9 characteristics, but instead of sex and gender reassignment, they had gender and gender identity. And actually since then they've dropped gender entirely. So it's just gender identity doing the job of sex and sexual orientation, which is clearly not what the law says, and clearly is a particular point of view, which I suppose people are entitled to hold. It bothers me for itself, but also because they're basically lying to the staff, and then the staff are lying to the children about what is and isn't in the law and how these things are regarded by society. So I worried about that. I made my thoughts known to the head and the deputy head, and because it's a Christian school, it's a Church of England foundation, I said, as chaplain, I'd really like to be involved in discussions about exactly what we do and don't implement. And they said, yeah, that's fine, we'll include you. So I was happy. Fast forward to the January inset session, and there was a little optional session. They had a sort of rota of 7 or 8 things, and you picked 3 or 4, and one of them was on Educate and Celebrate. I thought, I'll go along and see what's going on, because as far as I was concerned, nothing much had happened. To find from that the school had decided to adopt the entire programme. They just sort of bronze, silver, gold awards, and they decided to go for the gold award, absolutely the whole package. And I was less than chuffed, shall we say. Not only because they'd gone for the whole programme, but because I'd been lied to. I'd been told I'd be involved, and nothing. So I was not desperately pleased with how those things were. I went to the deputy head and said, what's going on here? And effectively he said, the decision has been made, that's it, end of, no more discussions. Over the course of that year, that academic year, I talked to staff and pupils who expressed a variety of concerns, some of them coming from a religious point of view, weren't happy with some of what they were being encouraged to do. Some of them from a scientific point of view, who wanted to say, well, there's biology and it's real. Some of them sort of more generally philosophically, and there were some upset, some just concerned, and many confused. So my practice in the summer term every year was to say to the pupils, what would you like me to talk about in chapel? When I'm delivering a sermon in chapel, so once a week, what would you like to hear about? And one of the pupils said to me, well, have you got a space left on your programme? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, well, would you talk about how come we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school? How come we're told we have to accept this stuff? And I thought that was a really good way of thinking about it. It's not, is it right, is it wrong? People can make up their own minds. But we're told we have to accept actually an ideological position. And that shouldn't be happening in any school, let alone a Christian school, I felt. So I said, yes, fine, I will talk about it. I delivered a sermon addressing that, saying, there are points of agreement. No one should be discriminated against. Everybody should be respected. Everybody's made in the image of God and loved by God. Absolutely no problem with those elements. But there are disagreements between most or the majority of Christians and some of this LGBT ideology. And so I set out a few of those areas of disagreement and said, you make up your own minds. You may believe these things. Or you may believe the sort of more Christian point of view, and that's up to you. But most important of all, respect. Respect people, even if you have huge disagreements about the ideas and the beliefs. You must respect. Loving your neighbour as yourself doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. It never could it? But you must respect that your neighbour sincerely believes what he or she believes, and that's absolutely fine. You can discuss it, but always respect. And that was deemed too damaging, too harmful to pupils. I really quite struggle to understand why so much.
Yes, I actually have read the sermon, and it seemed to me a model of tolerance, actually. I couldn't quite see what was the problem. And as you say, it's not just about LGBT. It's actually a kind of agenda which goes much further than that. But there's a big gap between that and then being referred to an anti-terrorism organisation such as Prevent. I mean, this is extraordinary, Sean. And you had no idea that this had happened.
No, what happened was after the sermon, I delivered it a couple of times to different groups in the school, the Wednesday and Friday. The following Monday, I was sort of called in for a meeting with the deputy head and the safeguarding lead. It felt like an interrogation. It felt very hostile, and I was told, no, your beliefs don't matter. What matters is how people are feeling about this, and some people have been upset. So I was very much on the back foot. How does it not matter whether what I've said is true or reasonable? That seemed in school, in an educational environment. Surely you start with, okay, let's evaluate the material. But so I was not at my best in that meeting, I have to say. I was struggling, and I was very clear. I think that the teaching of the Church of England on matters of sexuality is what it is, and it's not for me to change. And people should be allowed to believe that. And likewise there are people who believe that biology is real and matters when it comes to differences between the sexes. There's nothing radical about saying that. But the feeling they seem to have taken from it, that I saw in sort of the report of this meeting as the disciplinary process went on, was that it was rare to meet such entrenched views. Never asked me what my actual view personally on sexuality or any of these issues might be. I was simply saying to the pupils and the staff indeed attending, you may believe these fairly standard things. But that was too entrenched, apparently, and so they seem to have thought that was a sign of being an extremist, and extremists necessarily feeds into this sort of sense of violent extremism. And I wish I knew what was going on in their heads, whether they really believed that I was that extreme, or whether they were standing up for the ideology underlying some of this programme, or whether they perhaps didn't realise actually how ideological the programme is, and they just thought, oh, you shouldn't be objecting to being LGBT friendly, which friendly is one thing, and absolutely, but bringing in extra ideology is quite a different matter. And I think as a Christian minister, to be able to speak about values and morals and say these things, which frankly were little more than United Nations Convention, freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. I don't understand the steps between what I said and referring to prevent, but that's what they did.
They referred to prevent, but then it was, the police said there were no grounds for taking it any further, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the full details of what was said to prevent. We're now taking tribunal action, and they should have disclosed that information. We haven't yet had that, unfortunately. But the information we have is that the police officer said this doesn't meet the threshold for a referral further on. But he also said, and this appears to have been his personal opinion, that what I said was inappropriate for society. Inappropriate in a school and inappropriate for society.
The policeman said this?
The policeman said this, apparently. Which, I mean, people will be familiar with Harry Miller and Fair Cop.
Yes,
and
he's been on here.
Absolutely feeds into that same area of concern. And I wonder, would the school have gone down the line they did quite so severely if that police officer had not sort of made them think that they were on the right track? And I can't answer that, in fairness.
You mentioned there that this is what perplexes a lot of people, Bernard. Right? You mentioned there that there's a group came into the school called Educate and Celebrate.
Yes.
Right? And they were therefore taken on sort of as the school became a client of theirs, I suppose, to embed a certain ideology. Who are these people, first of all, Educate and Celebrate? And where do they, who funds them? What's their deal?
Well, the CEO of Educate and Celebrate, which is a charity, is Ellie Barnes, who started off in life as a teacher, and sort of went through a process of encouraging the schools she worked in to be more LGBT friendly. How many other people actually work for Educate and Celebrate is not very clear. The information on their website is a bit vague. It's difficult to work out the details. In terms of funding, they've clearly received funding through various sort of governmental type routes. They charge schools to go in and deliver the training and to sort of follow-up training to produce LGBT pride champions and whatever. So, yes, a little bit murky. And I don't mean that in the sense that I think there's anything underhand, but just it's really difficult to work out, and I'm no expert in looking at finances and whatever.
I think the point you make at the beginning, because a lot of people will say, oh, well, actually, what's so wrong in making somewhere more LGBT friendly? But the point is, it seems, and that's, I want to go back I think it's about a year or a couple of years in your story. It's about a whole different agenda, isn't it? That you went to one of their training sessions, I believe, and
that's right.
There was this chanting. Can you explain?
Yes. So the Ellie Barnes came to do a training session for all the staff of the school, and it's a junior school and a senior school, so it's right through from basically 0 to 18. And all the staff were there, and she was introducing the stuff. And as I said, some of it is absolutely unobjectionable. She was reminding staff that Section 28 had been repealed. It's okay to talk about sexuality in schools. Absolutely right. But there was also this sort of extra stuff brought in. Once she said all the good stuff that no one disagrees with, then she moves on to stuff which is a bit more controversial and a bit more with this political agenda. And that sort of culminated effectively in a section where she was having a sort of kind of a call and response bit, and up on the screen was the idea and the word smash heteronormativity.
Smash
heteronormativity. Without really much explanation of what heteronormativity is. So there was a sort of question of, does anybody know what that means? And there were a couple of offers of, boys like blue and girls like pink, and she said, yeah, that's right, it's that sort of thing. But actually, if you do an internet search for heteronormativity, you find out there's a lot more going on under the surface, and it's a very it's a sort of identity politics loaded word. So she wasn't very open about what it was actually meaning. As a summary of the whole programme, of sort of breaking down the categories of male and female, or even gay and straight, that's what it's trying to do, and to sort of level everything down to, I suppose they would think it was a sort of freedom, but I would say it goes towards chaos, because you just don't know what you're dealing with at any stage. So that's the sort of the hidden slogan. And I don't think any of the pupils ever heard that expression.
It was the staff.
So it was the staff doing this, but she was encouraging the staff to chant this, and many of them joined in. And I don't know whether they joined in because they didn't understand, because they were fully supportive, or because they were a bit embarrassed and didn't want to be the person who wasn't joining in. Any and all of those could be true.
Well, it's a sort of atmosphere is created whereby if you don't join in with something, then somehow it's going to be noticed.
Yes.
That is the general sort of atmosphere in which we seem to live. Have you had any support from the Church of England at all in this?
I have
You're
had...
being supported, so you're going toward. I should explain this actually.
Yes.
Sorry about it. You're going for unfair dismissal, aren't you? You've got a date for that.
Discrimination.
Yeah.
And unfair dismissal. Now that I've been made redundant, initially it started with discrimination, and now they've made me redundant. They didn't want me in the school, so.
Right. Okay. And that's being supported by Christian Concern. Christian
Concern, who I gather have actually put up a fundraising page on their website, christianconcern.com/Bernard.
There you go.
If anyone wants to contribute.
But what about the head honcho? I mean, what about like the Archbishop of Canterbury? Or
so far, nothing from the Archbishop. I have had wonderful support from a number of clergy colleagues that I've sort of worked with. I'm connected to Derby Cathedral a little bit, and the team there have been really personally supportive, and I couldn't fault them for a second. But as to the hierarchy, a deafening silence at the moment, as far as I'm aware. No one's told me that they've said anything. And to some extent I understand, because where there are legal proceedings, they can't sort of interfere in that in any sense. And certainly I was told when the trouble initially came up and there was disciplinary process against me from the school, that they couldn't interfere with what the school's process was. It had to be an internal matter. I understand that. That's fair enough, I suppose. But since then, should Christians, or indeed people of any faith, or just having a philosophical viewpoint, be able to say what they believe and share it? And should they even be able to say, let's discuss this? I think the answer to that is obviously yes. Yeah. I don't think that's too controversial for anyone in the hierarchy to come out and say, yeah, we support that element of it at least.
But there's sort of, I'm sure you won't want to comment on this, but there's a sort of, I would say, cowardliness about this whole area, unfortunately. And in this case, it's from the church, but it's affecting all other different areas now. When you talk about this general agenda, what you might call the woke agenda or identity politics, same thing really, they do have, and I think you've said that sort of, they do have characteristics of a religion themselves, don't they?
I think that's true, yes. And I think it's really important actually to distinguish being LGBT from this ideology.
Yes.
One of the criticisms of me might have been, but being gay isn't a choice, it's not an ideology, and you're comparing different things. And that's not what I was doing. Being woke and being Christian are ideologies, and I know full well Christianity is an ideology in the proper sense. I believe that there's good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and so on, but nevertheless, It's not based on empirical science. It's an ideology, as is identity politics, wokeness, whatever we term it. So that's sort of underpinning it. And when you realise that it is an ideology, as Christianity is, then to see it as a religion or an ersatz religion does seem to me to be a helpful way of understanding what's going on. There are, as it were, high priests, the people who really understand, who have done all the sort of the postmodernism and the queer theory in this particular case, or the critical race theory, or all those things, who really have got embedded in that, and the people who write the books, as it were. And then there are lots of sort of ordinary people in the pews who have got hold of some of this stuff and don't necessarily understand every last detail, but they think it's a good thing and they want to go along with it. Just as in a church or any religious group, there are people who've done the training and the studying, and the faithful followers who will understand some and will do some studying, no doubt, but many of them just know it feels right and they want to belong and be part of it, and that works for them. The comparisons are very strong. The Christian church, I think, gave up on heresy trials a long time ago and witch hunts. The woke people are perhaps a little bit behind the times on that. Their attitude, if I can say, is perhaps a little bit more medieval in that sort of
completely.
way.
There are heretics, and forgiveness is in short supply, is it not?
And I think that's one of the key things. Yes, that as it were, a true religion which has had time to develop over the course of centuries and you know, really connects with what it means to be a human being, knows that we are all frail and feeble and prone to sin, or whatever word you want to use for our failings, and therefore knows we need to be restored to the community and we need to be restored to personal integrity. And so some understanding of forgiveness, put the past behind us, move on, I think you find in all of the major religions, and it's certainly central to Christianity. I can't see anything anywhere comparable in identity politics. It just doesn't seem to exist. And, you know, especially in this sort of internet age where you can dig up what somebody said years ago and use it against them now, as if people can't change and develop and make progress in their moral lives is just, it's very scary, potentially, to be in the heart of that. Yeah.
Well, has it been scary for you?
Yes.
What's
to a
the effect
point
been on your life?
The effect on my life is that I don't have a full-time job at the moment. I've got a little bit of part-time work, fortunately, that helps, but I need a job. We need to pay the bills. So that's the immediate impact. But emotionally, it's been an absolute roller coaster. When you're disciplined by a Christian school for saying what you thought was a perfectly reasonable, not even blatantly Christian, but a sort of liberal, secular, make up your own mind. It's hard not to think, have I done something wrong here? Have I really been that bad? And so there were times when I was incredibly low, depths of despair, really. And that's very hard. You know, and as a Christian minister, I'm supposed to be all about hope. And yes, I am, but also there are the depths of the pit as well. You know, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is there.
When we spoke to Harry Miller that you mentioned earlier, this was the man, Harry Miller, the policeman, who had policemen turning up to check his thinking because of various things he'd liked on Twitter. He described how he absolutely just, well, despair isn't the word. I mean, I think, you know, he just went to the absolute lowest depths. But you have people around you as supportive, don't you?
I have had, and I have to say, as I say, some of my clergy colleagues have been brilliant, and the people at Christian Concern really buoyed me up and said, no, you are not mad. You are not some wicked person who is hateful. What you said was fair and reasonable. And I have to say, because the sermon has been published in the last week, the number of comments I've seen from all sorts of people just saying, well, what's wrong with this? This is good. This is fine. People just telling me it's not just fine, but an excellent sermon, and hardly anything of criticism of, well, you shouldn't really be saying that, and that has really been so encouraging. So just as the Twitter mob can damage, actually sometimes the Twitterati can show a support, and I think the fact that what's happened to me is on the face of it so outrageous, a terrorism referral for I think what's generally agreed to be a pretty moderate sermon. But is that the way our society is going? And I think perhaps, this happened a couple of years ago now, and I think actually that the tide is beginning to turn. I don't know.
Problem with that was that I hear it a lot, or the other one is tipping point. We hear we've reached a tipping point, and then something happens, and you realise actually no, we haven't reached a tipping point, and it is going on. You mentioned as well, I read a piece that you've done about the effect of what you might call postmodernism,
yes,
and the absolute obliteration of the idea of truth, and that this agenda, woke agenda, hard left agenda, is, in some ways just a result and a continuation of postmodernism in a way. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. It's different people have different views on exactly what the interconnections are with Marxism, the Frankfurt School, into the postmodernists proper, and then it's taken on a sort of applied postmodernism. Because postmodernism doesn't believe in truth. The sort of applied version, that the critical theory version, has a truth of there are people who are oppressed and the oppressors, and it's wrong to oppress people, and that's taken as an absolute truth. And then they divide the world up into the oppressor and the oppressed, and they want the struggle to overthrow that, which harks right back to the Marxist beginnings of the whole process. They're interconnected in complicated ways. But Marxism and postmodernism are both atheist systems, and certainly the idea that there is a sort of overarching objective reality type truth, rather than just the truth of oppression, which is just about human interactions. There's no real world, in a sense, in that even applied postmodernism. And as a Christian, obviously I believe in God, and God as truth, and God as guarantor of the objective reality of the world. And I look at Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's not, I am the opinion, the feeling, and the lived experience, or something like that.
My truth, his truth.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, yeah. So do you think it is, and because this is an argument that I've been having with various people indeed on this programme, that when it comes to critical race theory, when it comes to the woke agenda, in all its different forms, we're talking about one particular one at the moment.
Yep.
Do you think it is Marxist? Some people say, oh, no, there are no roots in Marxism, really. To me, it feels quite Marxist, actually.
I think it is. It certainly feels that way. It has that sort of character to it. It's transmuted through various different stages. As I say, it's kind of complicated to work out exactly what's going on. But the idea of overthrowing things, smash heteronormativity. Smash is a revolutionary word. It really is. And it's got a sort of violent image. So, who are the violent extremists in this, in terms of what they want to do? They want to break stuff down. And we know that revolutions that break down are generally not a very productive thing. It's easy to break, very difficult to rebuild something better. And I don't think they have a vision of what the better thing really would look like.
Well, I think that might be the big difference between then and now. For better or worse, there was a vision before, and it was one of equality and all of that or whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas now it seems to be entirely nihilistic. I just destroy. So what's the situation now, then, Bernard? When is the date for your hearing?
The hearing is currently set for the 14th of June this year. Whether it will go ahead on that date is a little bit unclear at the moment. I don't think we're seeing the sort of proper level of cooperation from the school's legal team in terms of getting everything ready for a case. Yeah. And because we've now had to add in unfair dismissal because of the redundancy, that may mean it ends up getting delayed, but I'd very much rather not. I think, if nothing else, the school is suffering somewhat in its reputation. And I think probably the staff and the pupils are going through a tough time. And I really feel for them, because I never wanted this to become some public cause célèbre. I really didn't. I made a number of offers of mediation, of sit down around the table, let's talk about this as adults, and actually work out what went wrong here and how to put it right. And none of those were not even responded to, really, by the school, which is so disappointing. I tried always to do the right thing, because that's my calling. I still feel I'm ministering to the school, even though I don't work there anymore. But there comes a point where you had to say enough is enough. It needs sorting out, and if I can't do it informally, that sort of legal process.
Have you had support from parents?
It's very difficult to judge, because I had a school email address, but I no longer have it, so I can't.
You don't know.
Be communicated with. I've had contact from a few people connected to the school, parents and certainly former pupils who have been very supportive. But yes, there isn't a sort of network where I would necessarily hear what's going on very easily. Yeah.
Just finally, once this is over, it's like out of your hair, as it were. Where do you see the future for you? I mean, what do you think is going to? What do you want to do? Presumably, you want to carry on doing what you're doing now.
Well, ministry in schools. I think that's my vocation. But that said, we sometimes talk about a God of surprises. It's not what I want to do. It's what God has got planned, and I've long since learned not to make too many plans too far ahead, and it will be sorted out for me. So I may find myself doing something quite unexpected. But yes, my initial thought is I want to get back into a school and trying to help the pupils to think and to understand there is more to this world than simply, what's the enjoyable thing in the next 5 minutes. There is so much bigger a picture. And yes, if everything went ever so quiet and I could do that for the rest of my ministry, I think I would be very content.
Well, maybe we can talk to you again when that's over, when it's sort of done, whenever it happens. But in the meantime, Bernard, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us about it.
It has been my pleasure.
Yeah, it's sobering to hear this story. I know that our viewers will be very, very interested. Thank you very much. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this week. And we shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.